Tonight, Jonathan and Amory will be joined by Dr. Hans Corell, who is the former ambassador to the United Nations and Undersecretary of Legal Affairs. Also joining is Michael Totten, who is the author of the 1989 Global Warming Act.
There it is.
Great.
There we go. Okay, Amory, could you walk us through this, please?
Yeah. Now?
Yeah, it's a great way to start our conversation and let
Sure.
people jump in.
First
Yeah,
of all,
well-
if I could just say, you two have one of the best conversations I have heard in years, and I hope it spirals across the planet. It was just a consummate discussion. Really
Oh,
deserves a wide audience.
Good.
Well, feel free to share it as
I have.
as far as you can.
So
Tell all your friends. Go ahead. Sorry, Amory.
this is a 20 or 30-year-old sketch of how our concept of security, what it is, where to get it, who's responsible for it, has shifted over the past few decades. On the left, security during the Cold War was perceived as largely a military matter, on which we were then spending something like $11,000 a second in the US. Now it's about twice that. And that was linked to economic security and then appended from that militarized energy and economic policy, and subordinated to it were energy and resource security. So that's how something like 3/4 of US military expenditures not many years ago were earmarked for missions related to access to oil. And then environmental security, which now, of course, we link very much with public health as well and with equity, was very much subordinated and was indeed often considered harmful to the military economic security and prosperity access. However, a post-Cold War view on the right adds back in yellow the four missing links between these elements. And I'm not good at drawing in 3 dimensions, but think of these as vertices of a tetrahedron, an extremely strong structure. And prosperity gets generated all over because the wasted resources turn into prosperity and indeed peace. But I like to think in the middle of the tetrahedron is a surrounded kernel of justice, which is, as Dr. King said, is really the key, because peace, he said, is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. So just visualize that tetrahedron with something really juicy in the middle.
Jonathan, and hello, Carl. Long time no see.
Hi, Carl. Not Carl.
But just
Spirit.
you guys.
I have a quick question that I know Amory has been addressing for many decades, but you have such polarization in this country now that regardless of who gets elected November 3rd, there's going to continue to be the polarization. So how, as a consensus builder, hoping clearly that Biden wins, what could be a profoundly consensus building effort or initiative that goes to your tetrahedron? And I want to put out the idea that I've shared with Amory before, which builds on a lot of what his prior work, is to take the military model of being an islandable microgrid with the on-site, the super efficient, ultra efficiency, and solar and geothermal or storage systems, and have that become a U.S. sovereign-backed bond initiative to do in civil society, because the types of security threats that we face this century are now of a cyber attack nature that our large-scale systems of the past century have become the most vulnerable targets domestically. So I was wondering if you could, and my idea is that it would bring in the conservatives who are security oriented, but it would also be community based, because it would argue for a distributed system that turns cities into mini platforms connecting neighborhood microgrids, buildings as nanogrids, and even electric vehicles as picogrids. So I was wondering if you had any comments on that. Financing it through sovereign bonds.
Yeah, and how you finance it isn't all that important, so don't get hung up on it. It's going to be a good deal anyway. You know, from the first century or so after Edison started the utility business, power plants were expensive and unreliable initially, but offered huge economies of unit scale, so they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And grids at the time were relatively cheap and reliable. But in this century, those bedrock assumptions reversed. We now have cheap, ultra reliable generators and relatively costly, unreliable grid, where 98 or 99% of our power quality problems and power failures originate. So now it makes sense to generate power at or near the customers. That's the logic you're describing. And then it turned out that matching the scale to the need, which is largely distributed, also brought into play a couple of hundred diseconomies of large scale, economies of small scale, as in the smallest profitable book. So politically, this can be very attractive to those who care about security.
We have on this discussion one of the most visionary and effective driving forces in advancing human security and the rule of law at a global level, who was involved in the creation of the Millennium Development Goals and the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals, which emerged out of the World Summits of the 1990s. An integrated human security agenda. The first summit was on human rights. The second was on the environment, Rio. Then you had women in Beijing, and you had addressing poverty and social development in Copenhagen, and then you had habitat in Istanbul, which is really the basis for the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wondered if we could ask Dr. Hans Karel, who's coming to us from Sweden, if he could comment about how do we get to create the energy, the economic, intellectual, political energy to move forward on the Sustainable Development Goals, and give us a little bit of like how they even came about.
Well, thank you very much. I've been listening to you and carefully, because this is a very complex issue. But for me, when I'm looking in the rear mirror and looking forward, and in particular my conversations with Kofi Annan, I come to the conclusion that if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there is one goal that you have to achieve in order to achieve all the others, and that's goal 16 on equal justice for all and the rule of law and anti-corruption. And this is why I think that one of the most difficult sort of things to beat here in the future is the corruption, is the uh, even in the United States of America is now turning its back on the rule of law and so forth. So I think it's so sad, because unless you have a proper legal system, it is very difficult to achieve all the other goals. And I've been looking at these goals from various perspectives: law of the sea, certainly the polar regions and so forth. And since I left the UN, retired from the UN in 2004, I've been involved in trying to develop the rule of law. And there is now a guide for politicians on the rule of law. And the idea came from Helmut Schmidt in 2008. He was 90 years old when I was invited to discuss the rule of law with a meeting of the Interaction Council of former heads of state and government. And when I started talking about the rule of law, he, 90 years old, all of a sudden said, "I wonder if politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law." And this led the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden and a sister institute in the Netherlands to develop a guide on the rule of law for politicians. And it is now available, and this was my idea from the beginning, at no cost, freely on the web in 26 languages. Latest is Urdu from Pakistan. And you just Google rule of law, a guide for politicians, and you will find it on the web. And as I said, it's available for downloading and printing at no cost. Nobody should earn money on this. And all the translators had followed the first translator from Sweden, who said, "This is so important, Hans, that I will translate it for free." All the other translators have done the same. And I hope that we will have more translations here. But I think the work that you do, and in particular, Jonathan, you are trying your best to deal with the nuclear problem, because here, when I look at the nuclear issue, I view this through the perspective of the Geneva Conventions. And I come to the conclusions that there's no way you can use nuclear arms without making a distinction between combatants and civilians. You will harm civilians, and that is forbidden under international law, according to the Geneva Conventions and other rules that govern the, shall we say, the way that you use force internationally. So I think that you really have to join hands. But when the United States of America is no longer in the lead, to me, this is a very, very sad story, because as a European, I never forget that who was it in the last century that came across the Atlantic to help us out of the mess that we had created, the First World War and Second World War? It was the United States of America. And now, who is at the rudder? Mr. Trump. And I must say, I never forget when I met with him. Kofi Annan called me one day and said, "Hans, I think you'd better come up to see me at 2:00 this afternoon, because Donald Trump understands that we need to repair the United Nations Secretariat. And I'd like my legal counsel to be in the room when he comes." So there we were, the three of us. And I never forget how he behaved. Procurement? No, I'll just come and do it. And then he wanted to make what do you call it? The wall, one of these walls that he has on the Trump Tower. It's called,
wall.
huh?
The border wall?
No, yeah, well, a border wall or something on the Secretariat phase two. It was zero, sort of one of these walls that he has on Trump Tower. He didn't understand that the facade of the United Nations Secretariat towards a zero is a landmark recognized all around the world. He had no idea. So I didn't believe my ears when I heard that he was a candidate to become president, and then even less when he became president. And I know that John Bellinger is one of the initiators of the letter that 50 former senior Republican officials drafted on the 6th of August 2016, 3 months before the last presidential election. And the title of the letter were, "We are not going to vote for Trump." And they explained that he doesn't have the understanding, the knowledge, the personality to carry its function forward. He will become a security risk for our country. And of course,
Well,
this
one
has
week today,
begun.
we'll see if the voters agree with you.
Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, and I mean, not only for his country, but for the world. So I'm so sad because for me, the United States of America was always the torch that when you came to New York, you saw the torch. It was risen not only for Americans, but all of humanity around the world. And what has happened? The US has to take the lead again to guide us through the problems that we have here. And I mean, you are experts in various elements. I'm a lawyer, so I've been working with experts in different fields, but I'm very careful listening to technicians, to experts, to the science, to understand when I give advice to the ministers of foreign affairs and justice in the past and to secretaries general, that I know that I'm basing my advice on true scientific basis, as it were. But sorry for being so long, but I just wanted to share my concern with you and explain how concerned I am at the present situation in the world. Thank you.
Hans, most of
Feeling
the
is
media
mutual.
focuses on the weeds being planted in the garden. Weeds of bad policies, policies that create divisiveness, policies that squander resources and corruption. They miss the point that the whole garden is being uprooted, the garden itself. And as an American, our Constitution has what's called the Supremacy Clause. It's Article 6, Clause 2,
Clause 2.
which makes treaties the supreme law of the land. So every time the head of state makes a mockery of the treaty regimes, which have taken years to build, he's not only ripping out the infrastructure or the garden itself, but he's undermining the very premise of the United States, because we're the first country created by a legal instrument. Our identity is not ethnic, nationalistic, or religious. It's legal.
Precisely.
And so that this administration has gone, it's as if an adversary wanted to destroy America without bloodshed. The consequence, however, is a lot of bloodshed in the rest of the world because of our development policies of claiming unlimited property rights over the global commons is causing the destruction of the planet with the climate. And the rule of law, the tool of law and morality are the only reins that we have over the capacity of technology and science to either help us flourish or destroy us. And the motto that I go to here that explains the whole thing, I think, is pacta sunt servanda. Promises must be kept. It's the very basis of the peace amongst nations.
Of course. Of course. And it's interesting that you quote the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Paragraph 2, because I was invited to New York University, I think it was 2001, to have a discussion with John Bolton on international law. And in that discussion, he denied the existence of international law. And I had to quote the Supremacy Clause: treaties entered into by the United States of America become the supreme law of the land, and all judges are obliged to follow, etc., etc. You know, I mean, and I think this is an extraordinary provision in a national constitution, because I don't think many constitutions around the world has such a firm commitment to international law and the Roman concept of pacta sunt servanda. Treaties must be honored, as it were.